Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the SAP IP Business Talks. Today, we will talk about something very concrete. It's operational IP management, and especially in the industry for industry use cases. We are live on LinkedIn. That means you are invited to write comments. I can see them here in the studio, and I'm happy to integrate them into my discussion. Today, with me is Per Wendin. Per Wendin is very experienced in the field of operational IP management. Per, thank you very much for taking the time to discuss that today with me. Just a first question. Let me know, how did you came into this, let's say, strange field of IP?
Well, that's a good question, Alex. And my answer is probably somewhat different, maybe, to other people's. I had no idea about IP when I was studying engineering in Sweden at the Chalmers University. But I actually had a desire to go and work abroad. And that wasn't so easy in those days. I mean, in those days, normally, if you wanted to be sent out, on a mission from a company, you would have to join a company, work with them for maybe 5-10 years before they sent you anywhere. But I was quite keen to leave Sweden and go abroad. And one day, the European Patent Office from Munich came to see us on one of those days, where they try to attract students. And I just went up to them and started talking to them. And they said, well, you can join us immediately in Munich if we want to hire you and so forth. I thought that's great, because I had been in Germany quite a lot before. And I spoke German and so forth. So I actually applied for the European Patent Office. I got interviewed and I got accepted. So then I moved in. This is many years ago, obviously. So having had no basically understanding what IP was, and particularly not patents, I was seeing myself all of a sudden, as a patent examiner, and that was how I got into the IP industry. And I've been in the IP industry more or less ever since, to be honest. I've been doing a little bit other stuff as well, but primarily my focus has been on IP. So maybe a slightly different way of entering an industry than other people have done. It was not any sort of, insights or any planning from my side. I could never claim, that I did a very conscious decision. It was a little bit like coincidence. I wanted to work abroad, and I did.
Okay, you stumbled into it.
I did actually stumble into it, and I've never left, but I've actually changed the way I'm working with IP from being a patent examiner, which was a great way of learning the work, so to speak. Learning about patents. I mean, it was probably the best education you could ever get, to learn about how to read patents, how they work, how you should understand them, and so forth. But the job itself as an examiner wasn't really what I intended to do for the rest of my life. So I left after about 5 years. But I must say, though, those 5 years were great in many aspects.
Thank you. Yeah, today we want to talk about operational IP management. You run your own page here on the Digital IP Lexicon with lots of subtopics, and it's all about operations, IP ops, so to speak. And for the ones who want to learn more, we have also available a podcast episode with you, and that explains even more on this quite complex issue. So I would like to start with a first aspect. So when we say IP management, so then some people hear, they make administration of patents in a patent department. So obviously IP management means something different. So it is a kind of integration of IP into the business. And this is said quite often. Yeah, so this alignment issue, but from a practical standpoint, that's not really easy. So what is your perspective on that? So how can we make that happen, that the IP strategy is an integrated part of the business strategy? How can that work?
Yeah, no, totally agree, that the business strategy must come first. It's not the IP strategy. Every business needs to understand, how it's going to earn money. I mean, for example, is it going to earn money on products, or is it more like services? So that's the key question. And once you know that, you have to align your IP strategy to that. So what I normally do, when I'm working with companies today, I have my own consulting company, but I did the same, when I was employed, for example, at Spotify or other companies before that. You look, what is the business plan? And preferably, if you have a bit of a long-term business plan, like 3 to 5 years, you look into that. How we're going to earn money in the next 3 to 5 years, and then of course you also look, into the nearer future, the next 1 to 2 years, and then also, if there is, hopefully, there is also some kind of product roadmap that you can look into, and get understanding of what we're going to do. But I mean, what is that we're going to do? Are we going to do products? Are we going to do services? How are we going to actually differentiate, from our competitors? Are we going to compete on price? Or are we more going to compete, on premium products and services? Or are we actually moving more into, the first mover advantage? Are we that kind of company? So once you know how the company will earn its money, how it's going to operate, it's really time, to look into the total ecosystem as well. Who are the competitors? Who are the suppliers? What kind of geographical markets are we going to be onto? And who are the main IP owners in this industry? I mean, because the IP owners are sometimes quite different from the competitors, that you see when you're actually competing out there on the market. So that's a very, very important input, to your IP strategy. So I mean, that's the key thing. You basically want to write an IP strategy to align that, and you need to understand, how you want to use your IP in that kind of strategy. Is it primarily to use the IP, from stopping your competitors, so that you can have your own product, with high margins on there, or is it basically, to lowering your prices for the production? Then, for example, cross-licensing might be a good way of actually using your own IP to get a price, to lower that one. I think, also some companies use their IP, for more like revenue generation. You have companies, who really selling, their IP or licensing their IP, and that's particularly, true for example, the telecom industry. I was working for Ericsson for a number of years, and everyone knows that Ericsson and Qualcomm and Nokia and the others, do a lot of licensing, of various 3G, 4G, 5G, and so forth. And even, companies, there are some research institutes. I'm thinking sometimes about these chip manufacturers, ARM, for example, who don't even have a product. I mean, that's a very particular business they are in. You don't even produce their own products. They just produce a lot of knowledge and IP that they license to other organizations for them, to be
Qualcomm.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a very clever way of actually using IP, and then that IP strategy is very, very clear how they're going to use their IP. It's basically, for licensing purposes. And the cool thing about that, obviously, is that you don't bind a lot of capital in big manufacturing plants and so forth, but you basically just, focus on research and development, and provide these capabilities to other organizations. But then also, another way of using IP is, for pure defensive purposes. That's probably quite a traditional way of using IP. You pile up, IP patents and trademarks, so forth, that you can use, for counter assertion. For example, if you're being attacked by particularly your competitors, it doesn't obviously work, from, if you call them patent trolls or licensing entities, then you need a different type of strategy for that one. But defensive purposes is not necessarily a bad thing to do.
So you mentioned some very big companies like Ericsson and Spotify, for which you worked and has a lot of experience about that. So what I really like what you say is, so there is I don't remember the name, there is a fashion consultant, a style consultant out there, and he says when you pick a piece of wardrobe, he says, ask yourself, what is this piece doing for you?
Yeah.
Okay. And I like that kind of thinking, because I discuss with my students in the master program on IP law and management. I discuss strategy, and I try to explain them something like an IP strategy as an isolated term doesn't make any sense. So what you should ask is, what is the role of IP within the company strategy and the business model? And that is these kind of thinking. So what is IP doing for you, actively doing? And in so far, these terminology of IP is protecting anything doesn't help, because from this protection nothing happens. So the question is, what is it doing for you, and explain the role of IP in your business model. And that is your perspective too, and I like that very much, because from this point you ask questions and not being satisfied with anyhow these protection thinking, which is typically used from IP experts, patent attorneys, but it doesn't help, because this protection leads to nowhere.
No, I absolutely agree with that. I mean, I thought as well, IP can be quite expensive investments as well, particularly when it comes to patents. So, I mean, cost really can increase quite a bit, over time. And, the bigger portfolio gets, the higher the cost is. And all of a sudden, you're viewed basically just as a cost center. Then you need to be able to point to, what the patents or the IP really does for you and what it does for the business. And then it's great, if you can take basically every individual IP asset, and link it to some kind of progress for the organization. What is this particular IP doing basically on an individual basis? And then, you see, if it's worth to keep it or if it's not worth to keep it, or even before you actually apply for it and do the spend, how is it actually going to contribute, to my competitiveness, or the lower cost of the product and so forth. So clearly, there needs to be a link between the IP and the business strategy in that respect. What is actually doing? I mean, just having a very, very large patent portfolio, or for that matter, a big trademark portfolio, doesn't really bring you anything. And that is probably quite an old-fashioned way of seeing as things, and I think that is changing by now. Actually, it is. And also a lot of organizations are under cost constraints. You can't just spend definitely a lot of money. You have to be able to prove what it actually does for the organization. So it might be you're giving a budget, and that's what you have to work with, and make the best out of it.
Yeah, what I try to explain to students is that at the end, we always play the game of limited resources. So otherwise it's not economics, otherwise it's not management, it's something different. I don't know which kind of game, but it's not an economic game. So economics means that we have limited resources. How big you be, it's not relevant, because bigger companies have bigger business plans and bigger investments and bigger need for returns, and smaller have the smaller ones. But at the end of the day, it's the question, as you said, what is the economic contribution of this piece, of this IP, and that we need answers for that. So just protecting ideas or whatever is said about there doesn't help anyhow. So the logic must be that I am able to explain the benefit, the exclusivity, so what I'm doing with the exclusivity which is given from this piece of IP. And that's a very good question. That leads in the right direction, as Marshall Phelps said in his famous book, Burning the Ships, when he went to Microsoft and started this discussion between do we talk about molds or do we talk about bridges? As you said, you have to feed an ecosystem like a Spotify. And so in such a case, you want to organize or orchestrate ecosystems, and you don't act with molds here. Your IP acts as bridges. So that has to be crystal clear out of the company strategy, to explain what the role of IP is. I think that, so I really like that starting point for an IP discussion, and not bottom up. So we have an invention, we have a creative result, and now we want to protect it. I think that that's simply not helpful.
Yeah, and I think also, one thing that might be useful for organizations is trying to understand, so the ratio, between your IP spend and your R&D spend, to see roughly where you are with some numbers. You can also see, whether it increases or decreases over time. You can even have that more or less like a KPI. You should really try to spend a certain amount or percentage, of your R&D budget on IP, and trying, to compare with other parties in the industry as well. That could be helpful. It's not necessarily, an absolute number that you must reach, or you shouldn't go under and or exceed, but it's actually quite good to have a fairly good understanding of, where are we as a company in terms of IP spend, compared to some of our competitors. I generally believe, in numbers and benchmarking as at least some kind of high level view, so you're not totally off. And it's also sometimes, good, for an IP department to be able to explain, to within the organization, we seem to be on par with other organizations. We seem to be roughly where other people are. So I know that sometimes that works a little bit like a good reason to justify, what you're doing. But then again, you have it. Basically, what it comes down to is each of the IP rights itself, need to be able, to support the investments.
Yeah, got you. Yeah, and then when you talk about investments, you have to talk about the return, because otherwise it's just cost. And
Yeah.
and that's the big difference. So the story does not end with spending. The story should end with how comes the money back. And
Yeah.
that is the question, and that is the storyline which IP should be able to tell. So when you say benchmarking, so that means comparing with others, obviously, and that leads to competitive intelligence. It leads to understanding the competitive landscape, understanding the product world out there. Like Porter says, these 5 forces. So what are potential? What is the bargaining power of suppliers and customers, and what are product threats? So that are all, so changing customer behaviors, changing customer needs, and when you try to understand these landscape with competitive intelligence, so what is your perspective on the action? So is there a concrete correlation between the insights which you get from the outside world and the actions you really want to do, to realize based on that information? How do you perceive that?
I think, the IP landscape is an important tool, when you're setting your IP strategy. And when I say landscape, I tend to think of that differently from, for example, an freedom to operate search or something like that. Landscape for me, generally, is a high level view, what the IP, who are the IP owners in the industry. And when we talk about IP, it's not just patents, it's also trademarks and design. It's all the different types of IP. Obviously, you can't find out about people's trade secrets, so that's not something you list. But you really should have a good understanding of who the IP owners are, and you can get a lot of intelligence from that, and you should try, to, if you have most products consist of different features and different modules and so forth, and you should try, to break it down into subcategories. I remember, for example, at Spotify, I think we defined 12 different categories within the service. Obviously, streaming was one of them. Content recommendation was one of them. Playlist management. So we had up to 12. We looked at them individually, and to look at them. And it's interesting, that some of these criteria, that you will be looking for are pretty obvious. Who are the main IP holders? I mean, are they your competitors? Or are they some companies you might not even have heard about before? They might not be on the market. They might not even have products. I remember, that one of the key IP holders within streaming services was actually Microsoft, and they didn't even have a service, but Microsoft have IP and patents in every area, so it actually showed up as being one of the biggest ones. And also IBM, these large organizations always have a lot of IP in any kind of space. But you're looking, at the IP holders, the patent holders, the geographic coverage, countries and so forth. Those are the obvious ones. But I think one interesting aspect of these landscapes is, of course, you can look of you can see the trends also in the industry, because you can go back, 5 years, 10 years, wherever you want to see, And with these trends, you can see, are there any new companies coming into the market? I mean, you can all of a sudden see, that there might be some companies who started to fight for IP protection, and they don't even have a product on the market yet. And, can see that, well, this company is probably going to enter quite soon, because why would they otherwise, invest in IP? There must be some kind of R&D behind this, in order for them to file for that. You can also see trends around specific technologies. For example, you can see that all of a sudden, IP protection is going down very rapidly in some areas. Well, that's probably it's probably technology that's going to be replaced quite soon with something different. So that's really an interesting aspect of the landscape.
So there are plenty tools out there, AI-driven tools. Also on the IPPA Connect platform, we have different service and tool providers which help with AI to get a better picture, to get a better overview, a more qualified picture, better qualified picture about these trends, and to understand what's going out there. So what is your experience or perspective? Is AI helpful here, or is it more confusing, so to speak, about what's really going on? What do you think about that?
I mean, I think this is an area which lends itself very well for AI in general. I mean, I've been long enough in the industry, that we were used to search, with IPC, CPC classes, keyword combinations, and so forth. And potentially, if you're very, very good searcher, you can still use some of these, if I call them old-fashioned tools, and get really good outcomes from that. But I think, every tool I've seen in the last 3 to 4 years, and I probably tried at least 4 or 5 different ones, everyone, is building AI into them, and they are quite helpful actually for analysis. It's pretty cool actually. I mean, I remember at Spotify, we didn't really define our services through different necessarily IPC and CPC classes, but we had an AI model which created, the understanding. When we talk about streaming, what do we mean by streaming? And today, most of these tools actually offer similar results. So I think AI obviously in the IP industry is having a huge impact right now. Everything from drafting and filing applications and so forth. But I think in terms of searching and landscaping and this type of intelligence, then AI is very, very helpful. And I think we're just seeing the start of it yet. It's going to be better and better and better, which means, of course, also that a lot of organizations, and some of these organizations will be able to do some of the work themselves. They don't necessarily need a lot of experts in searching, but they can do quite a bit on their own. They need obviously some kind of basic understanding of IP, and if they can't distinguish between a patent application, granted patent, then they are in trouble. But once you have some basic patent and IP knowledge, you can do quite a lot on your own in this case.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what I have learned also is this translation from the, let's say, patent language into the kind how R&D people, marketing people, product managers are talking and thinking, and that is a quite important support from AI to help to make that easier to understand what's going on simply based on a language level also, so that you don't need to be an IP expert to get a better insight in this intelligence, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, I've seen examples of where these tools have been really good at explaining what claim number one really means, rather, than an IP person, going into some of these features, and it really just explains it in, if I call it in plain English, to someone who's not really an IP person, but it's more from a product person, this is really what is being protected, And I think, AI can help quite a lot with that, some of these, as you said, the languages and the explanation and bridging, the borders between IP marketing and salespeople, because we don't always speak the same language, and that's not necessarily the faults, the sales and the marketing people.
No, they're simply not trained in that, and but it affects their work, obviously, and that is the problem, that they have a strong tendency simply to ignore IP.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think that's been true for a long time. That I mean, IP people are very, very specialized sometimes, but they could do with a little bit more understanding of the business aspect and also, of course, of financial analysis and so forth. So I think the better, you can train yourself as an IP person in other areas like marketing, and finance, the better you're going to be able, to communicate within the organization and to be able to explain, the purpose, of your work, and how it actually contributes.
Yeah. So we started this discussion with a top-down perspective, coming from strategy and drilling down to IP assets and their role. Typically, IP is done different companies. So they start with any kind of creative result, and then they would like to use IP to cover that, to create a certain exclusivity. And what is your perspective? What is your view? How should companies do that? So how should they? So we have these nice pictures where we have a smartphone in the middle, and then you have all these different IP around that. So design rights and patents and trademark and trade secret and whatever. But typically, this is not really managed in a company. So it simply happens. And what do you think? What should be there to be clear on the question of the value? So in which cases IP creates the exclusivity which is based on IP? When does it create a certain additional value, and when you just could protect it, but it doesn't make any sense? So what kind of logics, of mechanisms should be inside of a company for that?
Well, when again, when I was at Spotify just a couple of years ago, and we created a framework, we call it the intellectual asset and IP framework, which I thought was quite useful for explaining internally, primarily among our R&D people, what IP is and how it really relates, to the work. And when we talk about the intellectual assets, we mean, the kind of technology developed, the data, that derived, from the services and the brands and so forth. And then to each of these, because that's what they know. I mean, they know, this is a hardware thing, or this is a software, this is an algorithm, what is it, And we linked, to each of these intellectual assets, the relevant kind of IP, that you can protect it with in principle. So, for example, technology, it's basically something you protect either, with a patent, or you protect it, with a trade secret. Those are the main two options. And then, the principal word, like, well, if we can detect infringement of this, then it's relatively easy to make a design around, well, then we detect this, by a patent. If it isn't, if we can't detect if someone is actually doing this, or, it's hard to reverse engineer, then it might be actually best, to if I call it protect it, with some kind of trade secret. And we made it very visible, to people, what the best one is. I mean, I'm just talking theoretically now because it still haven't come to answer your questions about when you should be doing what in terms of financial. So that was really good, insights to what you can be doing. I mean, you shouldn't really make any kind of financial investments in any of these, unless you think, they're going to bring any value to your organization. So we used to, to go through to the project, so what have you developed? And then we classify this intellect assets. So, well, you created some technology here, you created some brands here, or you created some data here. Let's see now how they would contribute, to the organization, and then, how we should best invest, in its protection. I think that's what you should be doing. And on the sort of topic, patents versus trade secrets. I mean, that's a key question, because they're very, very different in nature. Patents have the disadvantages and their advantages. We know that patents are good because, one of the good things about patents, honestly, is that it's very clear what your rights are. I mean, it's written down, and everyone can see it. And so if you, for example, want to collaborate, with another organization, and you both bring in, know-how or whatever is into the project, you can clearly point, that, well, I own this, it says here, it's no questions about it. But the downside with patents is that they're quite costly. We know that they're expensive to draft and to prosecute, and the renewals are expensive. And of course, the information in the patents themselves, are public information. So if you don't want that to happen, then you shouldn't really file for patent protection. On the other hand, saying, well, we'll keep everything as trade secrets, that's cheap, it doesn't cost us anything and so forth. That is also an issue because trade secrecy is difficult for most organizations. I mean, they're pretty hard. It's pretty hard, criterion on, what a trade secret is. Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, if you want to claim in court, that something was a trade secret, it's not all that easy, to be honest. You must have secured the information in a very proper way. And I just have this very fun story, I need to tell you. Ruud Peters, a good friend, he was the IP manager at Philips for Philips for many years. And I think at one point in time, they went through the total IP assets, and they said, well, we realized we had 10,000 patents and we had 3 trade secrets because only 3 could be viewed as trade. Everything else was more or less known to at least someone who shouldn't be knowing that. So trade secrets are, on the face of it, great, because they are not particularly expensive, but they're hard to maintain secret. People change jobs, move to another organization, bring with them a lot of knowledge and so forth. It's not always clear when they go to the next employer, what was a trade secret, what was not a trade secret, and what can I be using, what can I not be using. So for trade secrets, rather than having very cumbersome systems, to trying to log them, I think education of staff is normally the best way to deal with that. You tell them, this is how it works, and this is what you should be doing, and what you should not be doing, and so that's pretty. I think it works well with education, but it's still, a gray zone. It's not always to be trusted 100%.
So what I typically say is that when you say you deal with trade secrets, so then the first question from my side is, does your HR department knows anything about trade secrets? And the typical answer is no. And then my answer is, that means you don't deal trade secrets. That's for sure. Yeah. So you don't manage them, because without HR, you're lost with trade secrets. I mean, everybody who understands trade secret is crystal clear on that. I think, and it is expensive. It's an organizational overhead, and in some situations like cooperation, as you said, it is simply not helpful. So it is extremely complicated to work with trade secrets in such situations. So
and I think most companies would put something like a confidential clauses into your employment contracts and so forth, which tells you what you can versus cannot do. And you look at that one maybe when you sign, and then you forget about it. And I think, it's very rare, for companies to actually enforce those against employees in the end, So I think education is better. You should still have them. I'm not saying that they should not be part of the employment agreement, but I wouldn't trust all my trade secrets just on the basis that some have signed an employment contract.
Absolutely, it is not operational. Yeah. So one thing you mentioned, assets, IP assets. We started with that, and we said already that there should be any kind of internalization of benefits, however you want to call it, appropriation or return or whatever. So my experience with decision makers and companies is that quite often IP is just seen as a cost, which means spending money, but not expecting a return. And many years ago, I think 20 years ago, when I started with valuation, and I gave a speech on a conference, and then I talked about valuation, and then the head of IP from Daimler Chrysler in that time told me that this is a nice thinking about future economic benefits, but patents don't work in that way, and you cannot say it, and this is pure speculation, and insofar that doesn't help. And meanwhile, nobody would say that in this way on an IP conference. So we have now more and more an asset perspective and a value-orientated perspective on IP. But still, we have a communication issue. Still, we have to tell a story to the decision makers, and that it is a strategic investment. And when we have this perspective on it, a lot of things changing, simply because the expectation on IP becomes different, and we have to explain how the money can come back. So what is your, from your experience with Ericsson, with Spotify, so what do you think? What can be done? What should be done as IP responsible, for IP responsible? How could we communicate this?
Yeah, I think the one of the issues is that, as you were alluding to, it's very easy, that the IP department, or several, might be more than one department. I mean, the problem with IP, another problem with IP, that they tend to be very, very different in nature. Trademarks, is sometimes run, by the marketing organizations, where patents is more the technical organization, so forth. So it might even sit in different parts of the organization. We all call them IP, but they actually do very, very different things, from the organization. But nevertheless, we normally know it's very easy to see, IP as a cost center in most organizations. That's clear. That's obviously not true, for organizations that get a revenue stream back from their IP. The sales and the people who sell and license their patent in those organizations, it's pretty obvious to everyone, that they don't really need to explain, why they're doing this job. I think the same is true for example, the pharmaceutical industry, where there's very, very strong link between patents, particularly, sometimes even brands, and the product itself, and once we all know that once a patent for a drug expires, basically, income drops by 90%, because you got all the replacements for that one going forward. So in those industries, probably not such an issue. But in many other types of industry, it is a problem, and to trying to translate, your IP into some kind of financial benefits. I think one of the absolute most important things that you do is that you're trying, to link your IP to a specific product. I mean, there should be, to every IP that you have, what is it actually protecting? What is it doing? Is it connected with a product or a service in the company, or even maybe to someone else's, to your competitors' product and services? You can use this for defensive purposes. If you can't find a link between the IP that you own and any product, then I would say that the value is zero. It's probably even worse than that. It's actually a cost, because it costs you money, to maintain that one. But if you can, prove, that there is a strong link. Let's say, for example, you have a product on the market, for which people pay a premium price. You're blocking, competitors for actually doing the same thing with you. Well, then I think that's pretty clear, what the value of that IP is, and you can contribute some of that sales and revenue, back to the IP that you own. That should be a pretty straightforward exercise.
I would really like to stress that point, because we have on the platform Bas Albers, who helps with a software with this association. For me, it is important what you say is there should be a link, for example, to a product, to a service, to a revenue, to a price premium. But that does not mean that every, let's say, patent protect an aspect of a concrete product. That doesn't mean that. That could be that we have Shazam. Apple has 1,400 patents around Shazam, and only a few of them are really implemented in the current version of Shazam. But the company is blocking heavily any alternative to Shazam, and for that, they generate this exclusivity, this impression of exclusivity, for example, for the speed of Shazam, and no alternative is available out there. So I just want to stress that point, because sometimes there is this misunderstanding that, for example, the patents have to protect an aspect of the concrete product, otherwise they have no value, and this is obviously not true.
No, that's correct, and I mean it is. I mean, I think for some products it's probably easy. Let's say you're a car manufacturer, you've got 3 different types of engine, premium, a mid-range, and maybe a lower version. Then you have IP which protects each of these. Then you can probably distinguish quite easily. What the value of those IP. But sometimes, as you said, even for platform organizations. I mean, Spotify again. Probably the same. For Meta/Facebook. It's super difficult to see, and I'm giving you an example. I mean, for those platforms, particularly Spotify, you pay one unit price, for the entire service. I think it's probably $10.99 now, whatever it is, $11.99, and you get all the different features. I mean, you can't just disconnect something, and connect something else. And for that, you have some IP protection. So which IP is linked to what part of the product? You can't do that. So in those cases, as you said, Alex, it's probably quite impossible to distinguish this feature of the product, is worth this much to the end user. You normally don't know that. How much more would the user pay, for, or not pay, if we didn't have this kind of feature? So in those cases, I think the IP becomes a little bit more, if I call it strategic. There is some kind of a portfolio value. The fact you can block out the organization from doing something. And also, from a pure defensive perspective, you can see this portfolio of IP, in a cross-license scenario, for example, against some of your main competitors. If I didn't have this IP, if I didn't have these patents, I would have, to start negotiating, with my main competitor. How much would I have to pay for that, for that access? Or in best case, how much would he or she have to pay me now because I have all this IP? So depending a little bit on the product, service, and so forth, I think you need to think slightly differently, but you should try nevertheless always to translate those assets into some kind of financial terms, because financial terms is the only thing senior management really cares about.
Obviously. So I would say we finish here for today. I think we should have another meeting, because that is so fascinating, especially what Ruud Peters did at Philips. So he really invented IP management as the discipline. And I show with my students a paper in which he describes that he starts to define which kind of IP the company needs, and then takes care that this kind of IP is created. For all the audience out there, think about that. So this is not a reaction on creative results. This is obviously a very active part, which says we know, we have a deep understanding what the IP is doing and what we're expecting from it, and we create it intentionally to make that happen. And that is something which I think is a very fascinating, a very interesting way. Siemens did that also with Beat Weibel. We have IP management letters out there on the platform to explain that. For you out there, if you want to work with us, with European companies, we have a call for subject matter experts out there. Per is one of them. For example, follow him. He can explain you how that works. Thank you very much for taking the time, Per. Thank you to all of you. And Per, be so nice and stay with us in the after show party on LinkedIn to answer to the questions, and also to give your deep insights which you have from the industry, that we all can learn and improve IP management for the better. Thank you very much and enjoy your Thursday. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Alex.